The scene you see is the marriage of two people in a typical way in Canada, but the relationship between the couple evolved to the point where they started planning crimes together. Some people referred to them as the Barbie and Ken couple because of their seemingly peaceful appearance. However, this couple decided to build their lives around crime. So, what's the story of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka? On January 29, 1991, in Canada, specifically in the province of Ontario, one of the hunters near the lake noticed something strange. They saw a concrete block submerged in the water. Upon closer inspection, they noticed pieces of human flesh protruding through cracks in the block. After this horrifying and bizarre discovery, the Niagara Regional Police began searching the lake for more evidence. They found another 8 concrete blocks, all containing human body parts. After extracting the remains, it was discovered that they belonged to a 14-year-old girl named Leslie Mahaffey, who lived in a town close to the crime scene and had been missing for 2 weeks. On the same day Leslie's body was found, 2 people were getting married in the town of Niagara Falls. It was a classic, old-fashioned wedding. The newlyweds were paraded on a horse-drawn carriage. The couple consisted of Paul Bernardo, age 26, and Karla Homolka, age 21. At first glance, they appeared to be an ordinary couple, even seemingly well-suited for each other. But most of their friends, and even their families, suspected Paul and felt he wouldn't remain faithful to his wife. What they didn't know, however, was far worse than their suspicions. On April 16, 1992, less than a year after Paul and Karla's wedding, another girl went missing. Her name was Kristen French, and she was 15 years old. After 2 weeks of searching on April 30th, someone scavenging for scrap metal stumbled upon Kristen's body in the woods near the highway. An examination of the body revealed that she had been sexually assaulted, beaten, strangled, and left in a location just a quarter of a mile away from the cemetery where Leslie Mahaffey's body had been buried. In the early days of the investigation, the police suspected that the crimes against the 2 victims might be connected and that the perpetrator could be the same person. There were clear similarities in the manner both girls were targeted, and since both victims were from the same region, it reinforced this belief. However, one thing was certain: the killer was highly experienced and accustomed to committing such atrocities. The police also believed that the murderer might have had an accomplice helping him carry out these crimes, based on witness testimonies, stating that the victim had been seen talking to 2 people before disappearing. Now, let's go back to Karla Homolka. She met her future husband when she was still in high school at the age of 17. She worked part-time at a pet store. At that time, Paul was 23, interning at a company to become an accountant, and nearing graduation from the University of Toronto. On October 17, 1987, Karla was attending a conference related to pet food and animals. That night, she and a friend were having dinner at their hotel when Paul happened to pass by. According to Paul's friends, he fell in love with Karla at first sight, and she reciprocated the admiration. After spending hours talking, they ended up going to one of their rooms in the hotel and slept together. Karla quickly became attached to Paul because he was sociable, handsome, and tall. She felt he was exactly the kind of man she needed by her side. Despite sensing that Paul wasn't entirely honest and clearly had secrets, Karla chose to overlook these issues because she didn't want to lose him. She was willing to do anything for him, even though she had multiple boyfriends during high school. To her, Paul was different. She often boasted about him to her friends, describing him as mature and older than his years. On the other hand, Paul, being the youngest of his siblings, was considered the most attractive in the family. Despite his innocent appearance, he had a difficult childhood. His mother was verbally abusive towards him, and things got even more complicated when Paul's father discovered that Paul wasn't his biological son. This meant that Paul's mother had been unfaithful, and Paul only learned about this when he was 16. By then, he fully understood the situation unfolding between his parents. Additionally, Paul had a strange habit of spying on his neighbors through their windows, sometimes catching glimpses of them in compromising situations. Over the years, these actions grew more aggressive, yet he managed to hide these tendencies well. To those around him, including his college peers, Paul appeared completely normal. However, it's said that this behavior is common among psychopathic individuals who mask their darker traits by appearing overly friendly. During his college years, Paul had multiple girlfriends, but all of them eventually left him due to his abusive behavior during intimate moments. Over time, it became clear that Paul had developed an obsession with violence, both physical and psychological, towards women. He enjoyed seeing them suffer emotionally and physically, especially in environments like bars or nightclubs, where people were often reckless and easily manipulated. By 1988, there had been a string of sexual harassment incidents occurring regularly in the streets of Scarborough, indicating that a sexual predator was on the loose. In May alone, 7 women reported attacks. The harasser would target women as they stepped off buses or jogged in parks, dragging them into nearby bushes to assault them. Although some of these women were released afterward, over a span of 13 months, the assaults became increasingly violent. This predator became known as the Scarborough Rapist. The police collected statements from the victims, but struggled to piece together a detailed description of the attacker, since the assaults occurred behind their backs. What they did agree on was that the suspect was young, with light-colored hair. The police began collecting DNA samples from men matching this description to compare with the DNA found on the victims. Over 100 samples were collected, and analyzing them took a considerable amount of time. That same year, in 1988, the Toronto police contacted the FBI for assistance in capturing the Scarborough Rapist. Months later, investigators analyzed the suspect's behavior and concluded that he likely lived in Scarborough and was in his 20s. Given the violent nature of his crimes, even against women he was romantically involved with, it was evident which profile fit best. When Paul met Karla in 1987, 3 attacks linked to the Scarborough Rapist had already been recorded. Yet Karla, who was supposedly the closest person to Paul, never suspected that her boyfriend could commit such monstrous acts. His treatment of her seemed perfectly normal, unlike how he behaved with women during his university days. Paul always showered Karla with gifts, flowers, and affection, making her proud to show him off to others. For a year and a half, Paul frequently drove long distances to visit Karla, who lived farther away, meeting her several times a week. Karla's family adored and respected Paul, believing him to be the ideal match for their daughter. In 1989, Karla graduated from high school. One day, she confided in her friends that Paul verbally abused her repeatedly, but she always forgave him. In December, Paul took Karla on a romantic trip to Niagara Falls, where he surprised her with a marriage proposal. She immediately accepted, and their wedding date was set for 1991. On May 29, 1999, the police released a composite sketch of the Scarborough Rapist, publishing it widely in hopes of identifying the culprit. Close to the composite sketch of the Scarborough Rapist that was released and published in newspapers, Paul's friends were shocked because the drawing bore an uncanny resemblance to him. In fact, Paul's closest friends contacted the Toronto police, stating that the suspect looked exactly like Paul Bernardo. The man suspected of committing 12 sexual assaults had now become a prime suspect due to the striking resemblance between him and the sketch. By November, more than one person, other than Paul's friends, had given his name to the police, and eventually he was arrested for questioning. The first thing they did was take a DNA sample from Paul, which was sent to the forensic lab. However, it was placed on a shelf with hundreds of other samples waiting to be tested. During this time, Paul had coincidentally moved from the Scarborough area to St. Catharines, living in the home of Karla's parents while they searched for a place to live together. Strangely, after Paul's move, the string of sexual assaults in Scarborough suddenly stopped, only to begin occurring in St. Catharines instead. If you enjoy the content I create, please consider subscribing and supporting my journey. Your subscription helps me continue doing what I love, and your comments mean the world to me. They fuel my motivation and help me improve. Every bit of support, whether big or small, makes a huge difference. So don't forget to hit that subscribe button, leave a comment, and share your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for being part of this amazing community. Karla and her family never suspected Paul. On the contrary, they adored him. Karla's younger sister, Tammy, who was 15 years old, loved Paul as if he were an older brother. But Paul saw Tammy as his next victim, intending to act out his twisted desires on her. What was worse, Karla, out of her deep love for Paul and her desire to please him, agreed to drug Tammy so that Paul could assault her. Karla even viewed this horrific act as a Christmas gift for her fiancé. On December 23, 1990, all members of Karla's family went to their rooms to sleep, but Paul and Karla convinced Tammy to stay up late with them and drink some juice. Unbeknownst to Tammy, the juice contained sleeping pills bought by her sister Karla, which were actually meant for animals and had a powerful effect on humans. This was done because Paul and Karla intended to commit this rape together. After Tammy drank the juice, Karla didn't stop there. She took a cloth soaked in sedatives and used it to choke her unconscious younger sister while Paul filmed everything. All of this happened while the rest of the family slept soundly nearby. Paul then instructed Karla to abuse her sister physically, just as he had done. But their plan changed when Tammy began vomiting and choking. Panicking, they quickly dressed her, tried to clean up the evidence, removed the camera, and wiped away traces of spilled sedatives before calling emergency services. When paramedics arrived, Paul and Karla claimed they had attempted CPR after finding Tammy unconscious. Tammy was rushed to the hospital, and in the early hours of Christmas morning, she was pronounced dead. The doctors concluded that Tammy's death was caused by a natural overdose, likely due to experimenting with drugs or alcohol, a tragic accident that could happen to any teenager. Her parents mourned her loss, believing it to be a terrible but unintentional tragedy. A month later, Karla and Paul moved out of their home into a 2-story house in a small town called Port Dalhousie, near St. Catharines. To outsiders, they appeared to be a loving young couple, but behind closed doors, things were far darker. Paul became increasingly aggressive toward Karla, openly boasting that he was the Scarborough rapist. He also began physically abusing her. Karla felt trapped, unable to confide in her parents out of fear that Paul would reveal their involvement in Tammy's murder. Thus, Paul held immense power over Karla, using threats to manipulate her into enduring both physical and verbal abuse without being able to tell anyone. It was psychological blackmail. And though Karla deserved much of the blame for participating in her sister's rape and murder, she remained complicit. Meanwhile, Paul's DNA sample, submitted months earlier, still hadn't been tested. On June 15, 1991, just 2 weeks before Karla and Paul's wedding, Paul woke Karla in the middle of the night with a surprise. That surprise was Leslie Mahaffey, a 14-year-old girl whom Paul had kidnapped near her backyard. He lured her into his car under false pretenses, intending to keep her captive in their home as his personal slave and repeatedly assault her whenever he pleased. What happened next was even worse than his original intentions. Over the course of less than 24 hours, the couple brutally assaulted Leslie multiple times, filming every moment. Eventually, they decided to kill her, strangling her, dismembering her body, encasing the parts in concrete blocks, and dumping them in the lake. On June 29, 1991, Paul and Karla married in front of over 100 guests, including friends and family. Ironically, on the very same day, hunters discovered Leslie Mahaffey's remains in the lake. A full year passed since the crime, and the Niagara police were still searching for clues that might lead them to the killer. They sought help from an FBI agent who had previously investigated the Scarborough rapist case. Unfortunately, he failed to connect Leslie's murder to the same perpetrator, assuming the crimes must have been committed by different individuals due to their occurrence in separate locations. Meanwhile, Karla continued trying to satisfy Paul's increasingly depraved demands. At one point, he asked her to bring over friends of Tammy's so he could drug and assault them in the same manner Tammy had been killed. Over time, Karla began luring young girls to their home, drugging them, and recording the assaults. Miraculously, none of these victims were killed, though they woke up with no memory of what had transpired. Every instance was meticulously documented on video. On April 16, 1992, Paul and Karla drove around during the day looking for a new victim. Near their home, they spotted 15-year-old Kristen French walking back from school. They parked near a church parking lot and waited. As Kristen approached, Karla pretended to be lost and asked for directions, holding a map. Suddenly, Paul grabbed Kristen, dragged her into the car, and sped off to their house. Due to the quickness of their actions, Kristen's disappearance was reported almost immediately, prompting police to cordon off the area and begin investigating. Witnesses came forward stating they had seen Kristen talking to two people in the church parking lot. 3 additional witnesses identified their car, leading police to search for vehicles matching its description. People started connecting Kristen's abduction to Leslie Mahaffey's murder, despite Kristen's fate not yet being confirmed. Her father appeared at a press conference, hopeful that his daughter would be found alive. Meanwhile, Paul and Karla held Kristen captive for several days, torturing her mercilessly and filming the entire ordeal. Ultimately, Kristen was strangled to death on April 30, 1992. Her body was dumped near the cemetery where Leslie Mahaffey was buried. With each crime, the level of violence escalated. In January 1993, Karla ended up in the emergency room after suffering severe injuries inflicted by Paul. After more than 2 years since the Scarborough rapist investigation began, authorities finally identified the culprit after testing over 100 DNA samples. The only match belonged to Paul Bernardo, confirming him as the Scarborough rapist and linking him to the murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French in Port Dalhousie. As for why Karla ended up hospitalized, it turned out that she and Paul had gotten into a violent argument, during which he beat her severely with a flashlight, leaving her with broken ribs, black eyes, and extensive bruising. Once investigators realized Paul was responsible for the murders, suspicions grew that Karla was also involved. Eventually, all the victims were connected to one individual, Paul Bernardo. Karla was brought in for questioning, though she wasn't formally charged. Upon returning to her parents' home, she broke down and confessed everything to them, fearing police suspicion regarding her role in the crimes. Her parents advised her to hire a lawyer and implicate Paul as the mastermind behind the rapes and murders, including those of Leslie Mahaffey, Kristen French, and Karla Homolka. At this point, Karla became crucial to helping the police apprehend one of Canada's most notorious serial rapists and killers. However, Karla had a condition. She would only testify against Paul if her sentence was reduced. This agreement was eventually reached. Karla's lawyers shifted the focus onto Paul, and she began confessing, confirming that he was indeed the Scarborough rapist and the primary perpetrator in the deaths of the 3 girls. She claimed she had been coerced into participating in the assaults, insisting she never wanted to commit such atrocities. When asked for definitive proof, she provided them with something undeniable. And in reality, she claimed that she never wanted to commit any crime. She told them if they wanted definitive proof, it was all recorded at home because every single crime was captured on video. Following Karla's confession, the police immediately went to Paul's house to arrest him so he wouldn't escape. On February 17, 1993, Paul was arrested, and the police began searching the house, a process that lasted for 71 days. However, they couldn't find the videotapes Karla had claimed existed, which would have conclusively proven their involvement in the murders of Leslie, Kristen, and Tammy. As for Karla, she received a reduced sentence for her cooperation and full confession regarding the murders. On June 28, 1993, Karla appeared in court for sentencing, but the hearing was closed to journalists and cameras, which angered the public. People demanded transparency about the outcome of such high-profile criminals, as it was unusual for Canadian courts to bar media from trials. Eventually, Karla was convicted of manslaughter in the deaths of Leslie and Kristen and sentenced to 12 years in prison. This lenient sentence raised suspicions among the public that a deal or agreement had been struck between the prosecution and Karla's lawyers, which is why the media was barred from reporting on the proceedings. Additionally, Paul's trial was kept confidential, leading to public outrage and protests in the streets. In August 1993, Karla was sent to a women's prison. While incarcerated, she filed for divorce but later returned to court to testify against Paul. Dubbed the Barbie and Ken couple by the public, people were astonished that such seemingly innocent-looking individuals could be capable of such monstrous acts. During the trial, the previously missing videotapes were presented as evidence. On May 18, 1995, the first day of Paul's trial, this case became one of the most infamous in Canadian history. Long lines formed outside the courthouse as people clamored for seats to witness the trial and hear Karla's testimony, which would ultimately land her a 12-year sentence. However, 6 videotapes revealed that Karla had lied and was clearly complicit in all the crimes, especially in the murder of her sister Tammy. The tapes showed her actively participating in the abuse and using Paul's violence as an excuse for her actions. The trial lasted for months, and the judge allowed portions of the tapes to be played for those present in the courtroom to hear. On September 1, 1995, Paul Bernardo, then 31 years old, was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. He also confessed to sexually assaulting 14 women in the Scarborough area. Despite Karla's lies and clear involvement in the murders and assaults, she had struck a deal with prosecutors. In exchange for her testimony, her sentence would be reduced. Unfortunately, authorities were bound by the agreement even after realizing she had deceived them. This deal was famously labeled in newspapers as the Devil's Deal, considered one of the worst in Canadian legal history. On July 4, 2005, Karla, now 35 years old, was released after serving her 12-year sentence. Although she completed her term, many believed she should have remained in prison for life. Nevertheless, she resumed her life, moving to Montreal to rebuild her image. She claimed she suffered daily nightmares about the girls whose murders she participated in and expressed remorse for her actions. In 2007, less than 2 years after her release, Karla gave birth to a child. Tragically, questions remain about how this child will come to terms with their mother's dark past.